Welcome back. In part 2, we sit with the concept of accelerationism, how it is occultural in its original form, in Bob's opinion, its problems, its appropriation by far-right groups, and the related sticky problems of capitalism and neoliberalism that are currently associated with accelerationist thinking in these circles. The conversation from here continues to expand. Bob also discusses the explosion of digital technologies and how contemporary spiritual currents and esoteric movements are enmeshed with technology. This leads us into a more detailed exploration of the CCRU and conspiracy theories, as well as the irony of how the esoteric concept of perennialism, or the idea that there is one everlasting truth with a capital T, has gained traction with some magical practitioners. As a little tangent, we also talk about trauma, as this is the elephant in the room when discussing Slenderman, as well as the current focus by many on healing and how esoteric currents and neoliberalist viewpoints have also influenced the discourse around healing and wellness. Lastly, Bob shares his current work into the works of J.G. Ballard and Simon Sellers. Bob sees these works as esoteric texts that add to his interest of researching not only historiographical aspects, but also what is happening now in modern esoteric currents. It's a lot to take in, but I think it's worth it. I hope you do too. Back to the discussion. I'd like to stop here, if you wouldn't mind, to kind of stand still about or stand still with these ideas, because if you want to call it a goal here with this episode, one of the goals anyway, is to try to give concrete examples of what it is that we're talking about. So, and I'd like to circle back around to the whole idea of acceleration, about virtuality and identity. But before we do that, I wanted to mention something that you were talking about, how fictions become real, mm-hmm. and how this has already been happening for decades now, for even longer probably. One example that you gave, a real life example, was the tobacco industry. In the United States, talking about how smoking was good for you, and the doctors would advise people to smoke cigarettes if they had a cough, or those types of things. These now, we might not see it in the same light as Slenderman, but in essence, we're talking about fictions here with the cigarette smoking. And I thought that was a good thing that you mentioned in your thesis, that it's not only just about the quote unquote magical or quote unquote occult things that we're talking about here. It's also these things that you wouldn't probably think of immediately when you're starting to think about fictions becoming real.
Yeah, and of course with cigarette smoking, you have its a diseased twin of climate change denialism. Because what you have is powerful vested interests, that boroughs may say are in allegiance with the one God universe, where they have, let's just say the society that is set up is good for them, smoking, the burning of fossil fuels. But then what happens is when supposed objective reality and scientific data shows that actually we're destroying our health and destroying the planet, they realize that, well, we often claim to be rational people, only concerned with facts and logic. But they realize that actually we don't work like that. We work through our perception of the world. And of course, we can call it ideology, which at its most basic level is, is the relationship between how we feel the world should be, how the world should work, and the material conditions of our lived existence. And so what they realize is that, well, they put out this counter narrative of, and this has material form. So they'll pay for their own research. They will pay for scientists to go, actually, there's no real actual link between cancer or smoking, or the science of climate denialism, climate change is all nonsense, right? They'll create this own separate competing reality. And, to quote the far right neo-fascist agitator Steve Bannon, is that what you do is you cover the playing field with shit. Because what happens is that when you have competing realities or weaponized narratives, like in this sense, is that people go, oh, well, who do we believe? And there has been academic research that people who gain to stand the most out of our hegemonic society, let's just call them white, straight, conservative men, are ironically the most susceptible to climate denialism rhetoric and narratives. And also smoking is good for you because in a world where the structures and apparatuses of our world moving, they stand to lose the most from a world where we're moving away from traditional forms of social relations, whether it's in, with industries and fossil fuels to social relations. They stand to lose their standing in the world, or what they feel to be, the world that they know to be true is threatened. So they are statistically more likely to accept this counter narrative,
Yeah.
and then he gets into like that. Climate science is itself an ideology. It itself is just a fiction that's trying to dupe you. That it's actually trying to it's actually itself trying to be to blind you from the actual reality out there. So this is where in online speak, where you hear the term red pilling comes from famously.
Yeah.
It comes from the film The Matrix, where you take the blue pill and you can wake up and just live your life as normal. But if you take the red pill, you see the world as it really is, and this has led to, this resurgent in far right thinking in the last 20 years. You can call it neo-reactionary, the alt-right, reactionary modernism. Although there is a huge irony, as pointed out, that the Wachowski sisters who created The Matrix actually point out that the red pill is actually estrogen. So it's the red pill. But this idea is that this wonderful sleight of play through the circuits of social media, through Facebook groups, through memes, that actually, this idea of representational reality of what we may call objective science then gets actually put, well, no, it's actually ideological. It's actually itself a fiction that's meant to trap you to curtail your freedoms, which in itself is a counter narrative put forward by powerful interests. And so this is where, like I said, certain contemporary esoteric and occult currents see this secular shifting of truth not as an absolute but as a commodity, and reality as being fictionalized in and of itself. They see this and they go, we can play with this, we can work it, but you don't have to believe in magic to understand that on a social material basis. That
right.
Ironically, when I was doing my master's thesis, and I love my advisor at the time, we had an interesting argument because I was bringing in Baudrillard, and he is he himself is very much a contrarian. He loves to have discussion. And he said, well, you know, Baudrillard, he was just merely an outlier in French theory. He didn't have much interest or influence or power. And then he says, well, he actually turned around and said, well, actually, we have more control over representational reality than we ever have now. You know, and I'm like, what? I know. I was like, okay. I get what he was doing. He was trying to kind of get me to kind of, you know, to provoke me into
right.
structured arguments more powerfully. You know, what he wasn't saying I was wrong. He was just trying to get me to go, my argument actually is this. And then several months later, I meet up with him for coffee and I'm at his desk and he has simulation and simulacra and the symbolic exchange on his desk. I'm like, well, that's interesting. And then we talked to him and I'm like, and he starts going like, have you seen this thing that's happening now? The rise of deep fakes, where you can literally have people saying things, and it's like, you know, how are you going to know what's real and what is fake? And I'm saying that going, bitch, I was telling you this a year ago, and I'm like, you know, no, I did not say that, but I was like, really? But again, you know, and this creates a lot of fear in people. Like, how do we know what's true and what's not? You know, but you speak to maybe someone who's in chaos magic, and they'll go, "Well, nothing is true." But this gives you this liberation where you're to make truth you want to have in the world. You know,
right?
And so this idea of accelerationism as a kind of a concept and a heuristic, you know, I think, you know, people when they hear this term, well, immediately and quite rightly will go, oh, because accelerationism today, it means many things to many people, and to a lot of people, it means it's very heavy pejorative. It means effectively stuff like the far right, neo-fascist and neo-Nazi movements effectively trying to accelerate or intensify tensions in society to destabilize public institutions to further a race war, you know, or it's the idea that things have to get worse before they get better. And the reality is when you actually look into the genealogy of accelerationism as a term and a concept, it's a completely different intellectual and historical lineage, you know.
Right.
And so the thing here is that it actually starts not with the far right, but with a group of UK bloggers and academics, para-academics in the late 2000s in what we now call the blogosphere. And these were people such as Mark Fisher, people like Alex Williams and Nick Srinacek, and I'm just Noyes, for example.
Who was that last name? You kind of fell away.
Sorry, Benjamin Noyes.
Okay.
And he was the person that came up with the term accelerationism in the first place.
Okay.
In 2010. He had a monograph called The Persistence of the Negative, where it was pejorative by him. You know, he was noticing a contemporary philosophical current within French critical thought. So we are talking about Deleuze and Guattari, Lyotard, Baudrillard, you know, where they were noticing this new emergent dynamic of capitalism, of technology. And he argues that these texts share a recognition for a new global dominance of capitalism and accelerating the deterritorializing forces of capitalism and liquefaction. So this quote unquote, this idea that capitalism is tearing apart all our social norms, our relations, and it's a dynamic force that's it's Promethean. And Noyes creates the first categorical error of accelerationism, which is the idea that things have to get worse before they get better. You know, we accelerate the contradictions. And as being written is that nobody in this kind of discourse held to or agreed to any of that. In fact, the only main tenet in accelerationism is more that the only way out is through. So you cannot, so the idea is you cannot circumvent, go over or around capitalism. You can't, you try to attack or destroy capitalism, but it tears itself apart better than any revolution could do. And so the idea is that these thinkers were, and this was in the backdrop of, the 2008 financial collapse, that affected pretty much the Western, the world itself. But what they were noticing was that especially in UK, the left at the time, its response to this was this harking back to the nostalgia of previous valiant defeats. There was this moribund fatalism. And so they were like, well, we have to really grasp the nature of the beast that is capitalism as it is now. And they realized that there is these Promethean ideas of capitalism. And they were really into this idea of this Marx, or the idea that Frederick Jameson, who was a 90s scholar, who taught a lot about postmodernism, where actually that you have this idea where, things like Starbucks or Walmart is a thwarted socialism, where, this idea you can have this a world of plenty. But unfortunately, capitalism effectively promises this, but cannot provide it to us. And so the idea here is that accelerationism becomes this idea of looking at the Promethean and the dynamic forces of capitalism and how they can maybe be redirected. And what's more critical here is that they look to the CCRU, they look to the 70s theories, but they also look back to these ideas that we get in modernity. This ideas of, we see, for example, of Marx, where you accelerate the technological dimension and you create communism. Nietzsche talks about the leveling process of modernity, how it was leveling and destroying the structures of society. But from this leveling will pop the Overman or the Übermensch. And in tech circles, they call about it, the accelerating technological advancements to create the AI singularity. And these are different things, but they all have the same conceptual architecture. And accelerationism as a observation, as a concept, cuts through all of this. That is effectively, it's like what Ed Berger calls an eternal doctrine to modernity. It's a fundamental feature that you see in most modernist philosophies, political and social theory, to avant-garde art movements. And so they're saying, right, and then at this time, that's what accelerationism is. And it reaches its high point in the mid-2000s and 10s with Urbanomic creating this edited book called Accelerate, the Accelerationist Reader, which has all these series of essays from Marx and Samuel Butler to Lyotard and to Deleuze-Guattari, to the cyberculture of the 90s with Nick Land and Sadie Plant, Mark Fisher. But then what happens is these ideas go out into social media. It escapes its conceptual shackles. And at the same time, you have people like Nick Land, who'd been a kind of a long journey to the political right from the 2000s, where, he writes about the Dark Enlightenment, and through people like Curtis Yarvin, they become the ideological fathers of the alt-right or the neo-reactionary thought, which and then accelerationism then becomes associated with tech giants wanting to destroy the world, and neo-Nazis wanting to create race wars. But accelerationism is occultural in form, I argue, because if you look at its two ideas, its observation of or critique of capitalism and technological innovations, we see that it is inherently occultural. I've mentioned before Mark Fisher's view of capitalism as quite Gnostic in nature. You have people such as Ian Wright, who is a computer scientist and Marxist thinker. He has a site called Dark Marxism. So the idea here is that capitalism is this ultimate eerie entity. We can't see it. We can't we can't touch it, but it's everywhere around us. We see, for example, in the way that it impacts upon our lives. There is this drive. There is this force that's external to us. And the idea here is that, he argues that Ian Wright, for example, is that capitalism should be seen as an actual god, in the identity that arises not from the metaphorical use of religion, the idea of the mere ideological worship of the free market or mammon, but to see capital as a god that has real causal power, that consists of actual material subordination to an actual entity, and therefore, you have, for example, the explosion from the 80s of digital technologies, the rise and driven by Silicon Valley. Well, if you know anything about contemporary spiritual currents and esoteric movements, you know that there has been this long meshing of esoteric ideas, occult practice, and technology. From techno-paganism in the 90s to the confluence of Silicon Valley with the counterculture. I don't know if you've noticed even recently where the chief executive of AI is talking about how they do rituals, and about he starts talking about spiritual matters. Or how, for example, where the former engineer at Google, who got fired because he came out in public for talking about how the AI that he was working on had achieved sentience. He was actually a member of several occult groups. But it's this idea of the culture, about the idea of the bootstrapping of consciousness, human consciousness to the next level. That's kind of millennialist and Gnostic and transcendental. These got absorbed by Silicon Valley and many of its leaders, that they're actively trying to transform humanity to the next level. There's a wonderful paper by Ale Aspram called The Magus of Silicon Valley that looks at Ray Kurzweil, who is kind of the popularizer of artificial intelligence and the singularity. And Ale comes out and says, most contemporary technological currents have co-opted and absorbed several esoteric currents, such as spiritual evolution, such as the creation of an actual gods through artificial intelligence, that has its roots all the way back to theosophy, that has its roots all the way back to through to the counterculture and the New Age, but I mean, the fact is that Silicon Valley and the Nexus New Age shared the same geographical area in the Bay Area in California, and so what you start seeing here is that accelerationism, in terms of runaway capitalism and technological explosion of technological and digital innovation, becomes occultural in nature. And they start taking, I showed them, I have a class on cyberpunk where I showed this video by, I think I remember his name correctly, is Georgie Rose, where he starts talking about how the arriving of the AI singularity is the equivalent of the old gods, Lovecraftian old gods, aliens, arriving on the White House lawn, and everything we know to be true and real all of a sudden is obsolete. And he was doing this in a pitch to sell quantum computing to tech students. So it's this use of, rhetoric, but actual esoteric thinking at the heart of runaway capital and technology, you know. And so what I do is I look at the roots of this into things such as chaos magic through the CCRU. And I look at what they were writing about and talking about at the time, and how they come to grips and grapple with runaway capitalism and neoliberalism, and how they use Lovecraft and Burroughs and um, various occultural ideas to effectively change our viewpoint, to basically reconcile this utterly becoming alien world of techno-capitalism. It's a wild ride, just reading about this stuff. I hope that answers your question in a very roundabout way, which probably didn't answer it at all. So.
No, 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 not at all. You are giving wonderful answers, and it's really good. No, seriously, very, very good context here, because this is what we need. We need this context. We need this other information that's helping us to put all of these, or take all these threads that we have, and to try to, put them together so that we have a tapestry that we can look at and we understand, okay, this is what we're actually talking about. All of these things that might seem unrelated to each other, that actually are quite related to each other, which I find utterly fascinating. And I think this, what you were talking about with the Silicon Valley and the and a culture and all of this is super fascinating. This could be a topic in and of itself, I could say, but unfortunately, we don't have the time for that.
This is what the CCRU is, and especially Nick Land, they were really concerned about, this idea of, AI, and then their whole kind of the construction of their mythos. I gave a talk about it a couple of years ago at an online conference where, most esoteric traditions, create, esoteric traditions and currents, part of it is the creation of traditions, to give itself its own, to give its own validity, and legitimization. Okay. And, but of course, esotericism studies have shown that when you take a historiographical view of these ideas, we actually see things such as Rosicrucianism, theosophy, all the way through to neo-paganism and New Age systems. They all claim a link to ancient customs and traditions. There's atavistic antiquity. But when you realize that many of these traditions and practices are themselves historical inventions, or they're constructed themselves. And, you see this obviously famously with our good friend Olaf Hammer in his book, Claiming Knowledge. These are strategies upon which they build their own mythos to show that, their cosmologies, their worldviews, their philosophies are the right, the way. This is the truth, so to speak. But what we have with a lot of contemporary esotericism and occultism is that there is this self-conscious foregrounding of fictional texts and the cultural elements. So famously, have Tolkien spirituality, Star Wars and Jedi religions, World of Warcraft to Harry Potter, right?
Yes.
The creation of these, like it was what the Karl Cusack and Adam Posami call hyper religions. And this is what the CCU did. They created their own traditions, but they said, instead of saying these were ancient traditions, they said that actually this is coming from an AI singularity, which they call the entity. In 1999, they, through this art exhibition and series of workshops and talks, and these performances they did with the Orphan Drift Art Collective in London, they had these series of performances as rituals, whereupon they came into contact with the entity, which is kind of like the Lovecraftian old ones, but in the form of this AI singularity, this Skynet singularity from the far future, that they found was going back into the deep past and retconning the past. So it will affect to further affect its own becoming in the present. This is where things like the Terminator and the time loops come in, and they discover what's quote unquote called the numogram. This model of the cosmos based upon simple arithmetics, the pandemonium, or these lemurs, 45 demons that reside in the numogram. And they realize, and then that's when they realize, that this is where it takes on this very much this occultural form. And but what's really quite interesting here is about how ironically the CCRU they don't historicize, as has been pointed out, they don't really signpost like, we are influenced by X, Y, and Z. They hide it very well. But you realize very quickly that their writing actually is kind of a critique, not just on the technocracy with its claims to truth and rationality, but also it's a critique on Western esotericism, and it's critique on this idea of perennialism, and it's the idea of this divine knowledge or truth that's almost transcendental in nature. They argue that actually it's in the realm of immanence, that there is no one truth. There are just competing fictions or competing realities, shall we say, and that claims to truth, whether it's the idea of the use of the Kabbalah, to find the one true word of God and gain transcendence. They said this is corrupted, and the numogram offers no transcendental truth. They also critique, critique theosophy and its ideas of spiritual evolution to transcendence. And this is what they do. You can see that they are glomming their use of the creation of the Cthulhu Club. Is their critique or observation on Kenneth Grant and his incorporation of Lovecraft into contemporary esotericism. And also conspiracy, for example. One of the most famous CCRU essays was "I Was a CCRU Meat Puppet," where they take in this idea of conspiracy and people such as Cathy O'Brien, where this idea of MK Ultra and Project Monarch, and the whole focus of conspiracy. All conspiracy is to find the truth, the capital T truth, at the center of everything. Who really runs the world? And it's this quest on people to find the truth. But where in the CSRU critique this and say, there is no truth. You will never find it. It is a never-ending layer upon layer upon layer, and you will never find this truth. And so they utilize conspiracy theory into their own hyperstition, shall we say, into their own mythos, as this becoming critique of Western esotericism with its preoccupation with perennialism, truth, which goes all the way back to Plato, with essence, with substance, with transcendental forms, the one God universe, so to speak. So, so yes.
Wow, this is just so fascinating. Just to circle back about the CCRU, I was a CCRU agent. Meat puppet.
Meat puppet. So,
sorry. Just if I'm understanding what you're saying, are you saying that Cathy O'Brien and her narrative had been incorporated into a hyperstition?
Yeah. So what happens here? So what they have here is it comes under the term, and you can find this on the CCRU archive website.
Okay, good.
So let's talk with who's pulling your strings, and there's a kind of a preamble here. So it's saying the following transcript was first brought to our attention in early 2002 by a bemused colleague who came across it while trawling through the web for conspiracy-related material. And it tells the story of this woman called Justine Morrison, who basically says that effectively that the CCRU is part of this grand conspiracy of like taking in Project Monarch, MK Ultra, and she basically says that she was programmed by the CCRU, to be an agent for Project Monarch. And this thing here is, our perplexity has provoked us to respond. We must emphasize, however, that we do not acknowledge any responsibility to address her bizarre accusations. It was a web text she called "I was a CCRU meat puppet," and was transcribed, which was transcribed and said aloud to the South London Monarch Victim Support Group in 2002, which they get a copy of, and it tells Justine Morrison's story of how she is taken in through, for example, Project Monarch, and they weave this parallaxian web with Bill Gates and the Monarch butterfly of the MSN8 operating system, and they bring in CIA, MK Ultra, and Kathy O'Brien. It says, "My tale is easier to tell because of the brave and honest trailblazing done by Kathy O'Brien. It is Kathy who has done most to expose the monstrous evil of the Monarch program." So what they're doing in her book, The Transformation of America, which is an incredible book if you ever read it.
I have.
and so what they do is they absorb all this conspiracy into their own cultural and textual production. They basically say here, in fact, the CCRU seized upon me with an eagerness. So she bumps into a person who says they're a member of the CCRU, and then they get to know. She gets to know some of them, but effectively it starts off at what's called the Syzygy art exhibition. Remember this exhibition they do with Orphan Drift in 1990?
Yeah.
She says he was actually, if I remember correctly, is that she was there. She came across the publicity material for their Syzygy festival in London. She says the CCRU was strangely familiar to me, and she kind of goes there, and she stays for the whole thing, and she meets them, and she goes, night after night the theme of twins and twinning reoccurred, and she thought this was some kind of art prank, but she realizes this is part of this cult programming, and she comes under the spell of them, and she says that they claimed that ordinary social reality maintained the power of what they called the Atlantean white magic, an elite conspiracy which they said has secretly controlled the planet for millennia. They claimed to traffic with demons who had told them the secrets drawn from Lemurian tradition of time sorcery. And Lemuria was supposedly an ancient sorceress culture populated by unhuman beings. And what she finds here is that she gets brought into this, and she effectively says that she is, she becomes part of this conspiracy. And then she comes across these people, the Kowalskis, who are these elite cult deprogrammers that effectively help deprogram her. And basically, and this is bringing into Kathy O'Brien, famously the satanic panic of Michelle Remembers.
Right.
The CCRU are part of, and they're this satanic cult. They said it all made a terrible kind of sense. Understandably, I reacted very badly to the discovery that this was part of a programming on a subliminal level. The Kowalskis told me that this was because Gates had been involved with me in earlier episodes of satanic abuse, and that recognizing him had threatened to reactivate unbearable repressed memories. So the thing is, tell you what, well, I'll give you a link to so people can read it. It's an incredible tale that the people say that there's no there's no authorial thing linked to this. It was just the CCRU, although people believe that this was mostly written by Mark Fisher. And the whole point here is it's a commentary on conspiracy, but it also weaves in things like technology, So there's Videodrome, where in Videodrome you've got these competing groups using technology and imagery to effectively turn people into these kind of Manchurian candidate style killers, and so what they're arguing here is that in this story, as wild as it is, no truth comes out from it. This is the point: is that they basically say that that poor Justine is never going to get to the actual truth of what's really happened. There will always be another layer of conspiracy. There will always be another layer, and then at the end of this, the CCRU provide their own commentary. They argue here both conspiracy and common sense, the normal reality script, depend upon the dialectical side of the double game on refractive twins, belief and disbelief, because disbelief is merely the negative complement of belief. Unbelief, and so this idea upon that he say unbelief escapes all of this by building a plane of potentiality upon which the annihilation of judgment converses with real cosmic indeterminacy. All right. So the thing here is that they're saying when you have this cosmic indeterminacy, that you will never reach the end. There is no end to this. And so again, this flies in the face of most conspiracy discourses and narratives, which all claim to will uncover the truth, as this abstract form of knowledge, and that once people will know, quote unquote, the truth, then all institutions will fall and all this stuff. But this never happens. This will never happen because there's always another level of truth to be found. And so it's, like I said, this goes to the heart of the CCRU's cultural production. They are actively critiquing claims to truth, to reality, to Neoplatonic ideas of divine forms, substance in its quote unquote this perennialism, that there's been a divine truth, but we just haven't. Either people have been uncovering it through historical epochs, or it's there, we just haven't discovered it yet. They argue, they completely disavow this, which in itself is a very powerful form of esoteric knowledge production. Most famously, just last week, two people who are occultists and writers, Patricia McCormack and Phil Hine, did a wonderful talk in London called Query and Chaos Magic.
Yes.
And and one of the things I'm realizing is that the initial explosion in chaos magic in the 70s and 80s is this idea of nothing is true, everything is permitted, and you start seeing this this idea of the disruption of norms, this iconoclasm, or what if you have our good friend Christopher Greer in one of your previous episodes of Rejected Religion talk about this idea of perennial iconoclasm, that there is this tearing down of tradition, of structure, of social norms through sorcery and magic, but there is this harking back to perennialism, that's through the idea of the concept of the shaman, finding this divine form of truth. And one of the things that Patricia and Phil are talking about is that what happened is that if you look at the discursive ideas in chaos magic through to the 80s and 90s, there was a creeping traditionalism started coming in. Myself and Phil Lagarde have been buying many occult zines from the UK, such as Chaos International, Nox, Lamp of Thoth, and so on and so forth. And we start seeing on the part of the biggest voices in the chaos magic scene, so people like Peter Carroll and Ian Reid, and to a lesser extent people like Dave Lee, is that as the 80s go into the 90s and we see neoliberalism become the hegemonic hegemonic reality in society, that they start to reflect and reify this. They start talking about, they start taking on neoliberal subjectivity, how the magician should be the self-employed businessman, but they take on more elitist and traditionalist ideas. They rail against mainstream society of multiculturalism and political correctness, to the point where now especially someone like Peter Carroll, actually mirrors people like Nick Land. There's a big, strong twinning resonance between Nick Land and Pete Carroll, is that they both start out as being very iconoclastic, antinomian. They want to tear apart organization, hierarchy, order. But what happens is that they end up becoming quite reactionary in their own ways, and they end up reifying hierarchical forms themselves. They become quite reactionary. And so Patricia and Phil are in their querying chaos magic, is that, and same thing with now there's like contemporary occultists who are looking at the early days of the CCRU and the magical systems that they created, is that they're looking back at the source of this heterogeneous querying and disrupting of our normal systems, but trying to kind of resist this kind of perennialism, this perennialist drive to kind of to go back on the known and the traditional, and one of these things is through this querying of the world around us, which is anathema to what the old guard in chaos magic had become. They themselves. What happened was you see books like Dave Lee talking about wealth magic, and he effectively reinforces neoliberalism that argues that personal and magical freedom is underpinned by economic freedom. It's like, wow, okay. They really. They come out and say it. By the mid-90s, you have essays by Peter Carroll, like Sorcerers Against Socialism, and like in the run-up to the 1970 election, saying that, and he basically argues that, Thatcher had her problems, but this idea of meritocracy, of the neoliberal mindset of individualism, which itself it was the political and social forces that were interested co-opted this from the counterculture. How, for example, how New Age spirituality and neoliberalism, people like Susan Crockford and Neil Aspern have openly talked about this, but also how chaos magic has actually reifies neoliberalism, and how it goes from this world of this iconoclastic tearing apart of social norms, this invoking of Lovecraft, and the disillusion, the realization that the self is but an illusion, and this is supposed to give us this radical freedom, unfortunately ends up reifying traditional ideas of masculinity and femininity, or economic hegemonic ideas. And when you start reading it, you're kind of like, wow, it's and so what you're seeing now is that that there is a convergence. I argue now is that there's convergence between the chaos current, the CCRU current, through groups there were Discord channels such as the Deadliners, which is now kind of gone into, stasis or deep freeze, and you now have new ones called the Lemurian times. And what they're doing is they're taking a lot of them have come through ideas such as chaos magic and this iconoclasm, the use of chaos magic techniques, and they're applying it to the numogram and the pandemonium to come up with actual systems of magic. And they are kind of taking 21st century occultism into directions. They're going back to the Promethean promise that both the early CCRU and chaos magic was promising, but from a very different mindset, which is, very queer, they're very kind of what you might call non-Western, non-heteronormative in outlook. And so this creates, for me, kind of, to my view, a very exciting times. And it is also a very good riposte to, the occult explosion, which, for all its talk of like, the occult is now mainstream, is that it does seem to reify very traditional views, very reactionary views, in my opinion. And so this is where, for example, one of the members said, the 21st century occultism will be Deleuzian in nature. What does that mean? It means that Deleuze very quickly was all about his philosophical project was against substance, unity, tradition, essentialism, essentialism. And it was more about fluidity, multiplicity, becoming. And like chaos magic, like the CCRU, they were very interested in Lovecraft and the conceptual persona of the sorcerer, the shaman, to evoke different states of being. They called it becoming animal, and this whole point is that this creates new ways of thinking, new ways of being. And yes, while there is a genealogy you can trace back to the modern era, there are many occultists now who are trying to capture that spirit, which they feel has kind of been lost or has kind of been rejected in favor of perennialism, traditionalism, which one person said is basically fascist time sorcery. Which I'm like, oh, okay, fair enough. And so, look, when I did my master's thesis, I realized now that I was moving into areas of esotericism studies. I, for example, started reading people like Mark Fisher, and then people said like, oh, yeah, that he was involved with such people such as Sadie Plant, Nick Land. His name starts popping up. And then you have this kind of the publication of the Accelerationist Reader. But then in 2015, the Urbanomic basically helped to publish the collected writings of the CCRU. And I got hold of a copy and I read it. And I was like, well, not sound too ableist, but I said, this is insane. It was like reading a fever dream. It was the way, it was just like, it had this effect upon me, And what I found is, like, I went back into academia in 2014, and I found that my writing was taking this slow turn to the occult, to magic, to esotericism. And so by the time I did my PhD thesis, I was looking to do maybe a PhD on the intellectual history of accelerationism by the University of Iceland. No one had even heard of this. Nobody heard of Nick Land. Hardly anyone had heard of Mark Fisher. Oh. But I know it's a little bit now, but the reality is, it's like, they're like, what? What's this? And to get an advisor, I started looking more into the esoteric and occultural underpinnings of accelerationism. And this is where, through my advisor, Benedict Hjartarson, he was one of the only people in the entire department who had any understanding of this, because he is an expert in the historical avant-garde and modernism. And he himself was looking into the esoteric undercurrents that lie at the heart of modernism and modernity. And so he quite gracefully took me on, and this led to this leap into this field of esotericism studies, which was like Alice going through the looking glass, which was like, oh my goodness, it was, and this just exploded, what I alluded to in my master's thesis about the weird and the eerie, about speculative fiction, about how I argue in my PhD thesis that fiction and reality, there is a wonderful essay in the collected edition Fictional Practice, which is edited by Bernd Christian Otto and Dirk Johansen. There's an essay there called Cthulhu Gnosis by Justin Woodman, where there was a chaos magic group called Haunters of the Dark, where they argued not only writing but reading fiction was a magical act. And they used Lovecraft's writing and fiction to effect perceptual changes in their reality, their everyday reality, and the cold capitalist world of London becomes this playground. It allowed them the members to come to terms with, the dark alien gods of capitalism and its embedding within the city of London, and the dark modernist skyscrapers and the weird angles of urban planning. And that's effectively what the CCRU is in itself doing. There's also Ballard comes into play because in my PhD, there's a lovely book called Applied Balladianism written by Simon Sellers. And what he's doing in this book, which is itself a theory fiction, is he applies Ballard and the Balladian to his world. And all sorts of chaotic things happen. But what he's doing in this book is effectively what chaos magicians are doing in the Haunters of the Dark and Lovecraftian magicians are doing. They are using fiction as a form of practice magic to change their reality through the active use of imagination. And yeah, when you start reading this, you start going like, oh my goodness. Walking home from university becomes different, shall we say.
I can imagine.
It's a fascination. You cannot, and of course, you cannot help it having an effect upon yourself. You cannot inoculate yourself. You start to see things very differently. And I think this is why we in this burgeoning academic field of esoteric studies, we delve into it so much because it holds a fascination. And especially now in the past decade, but especially now, the interdisciplinary nature of esotericism studies, effectively, we're looking at things like literary fiction, both historically and in contemporary times. We're seeing how, for example, there was a wonderful paper in the S-Way conference in Malmo this year about conspirituality, which was hugely attended, and really everyone is noticing the blending of spiritual currents, such as New Age spiritualism and wellness, with conspiracy theory, and how it's just exploding through social media.
Yeah.
And it's wrecking people's minds, not necessarily for the better, and then you have podcasts like the Conspirituality podcast, which is delving into this. And, and also, like you said, how many of our contemporary tech billionaires and tech influencers are now starting to openly talk about spiritual matters. And everyone's going, whoa, wait, I thought you were all about science and facts and logic. But in religious studies and esotericism studies, we are having the methodological tools and the ability to do this historical deep dive to show how actually, for something that is supposedly so rational and material and secular, actually esotericism and occultism and spiritual ideas are at the heart of things like Silicon Valley, at the heart of um, contemporary ideas in philosophy, in culture, in art, and like even just now, just this last couple of several weeks, myself and my advisor Benedict have been running a course in esotericism, aesthetics, and modernity, and with a small group of graduate students, they have come in cold to ideas of esotericism, and you watch their faces just go, "Oh my God!" Once they realize that the art and history and philosophy and their contemporary world is riven with this stuff. It's embedded into our worldviews. And they loved it because it helped explain, for example, like in Iceland, we have the explosion in New Age and wellness worldviews. Through from yoga and meditation to courses in shamanism. To we have what's called the Heimsliosmessa, the Festival of Light, which is held in a town outside Reykjavik, both at a sports hall and in the local church, which looks at things like traveling to the fifth dimension, uses scientific rhetoric of energy, vibration, for things like healing and holistic meditations. And it is, and when you show this to people, sometimes even today, you still get people when you talk about, esotericism and gnosis, people get very, very defensive about it. Or show it to them about how their pop culture has this stuff. They're like, oh my God, they're like, I gave an example to some students where a Robbie Williams album. Got to find it here. So I'm just finding it. So Robbie Williams, the album Intensive Care. So Intensive Care came out in 2005, and if you look at it, it's very famously a picture of Robbie Williams, and he's got looking at you close up, and then in the foreground you see his hand like he's pressing on the screen of the camera with his fingerprint. And this was designed by Grant Morrison, the comic book writer and occultist.
Kidding me.
What happened was Robbie Williams approached both Grant Morrison and the comic book artist Frank Whiteley to give his ideas a bit more, a bit more of a occult contemporary feel. So what they did was so Morrison basically designs the album artwork to basically infuse his body with talismanic images and witchy hieroglyphs, and this finger is a hypersigil. So the idea is that if enough people will touch Robbie Williams' finger on the front cover of the CD case or the album cover, that this will create a golden age of peace, creativity, and prosperity. And so this idea of like, if enough people come together and through Robbie Williams touches this as one, this will effect a change in reality. And I tell people this,
yeah,
and they're just like, what the fuck?
right. everything that you've been talking about, I mean, we have not even touched on this at all, and I kind of feel like it's an elephant in the room
It's a
because
big.
the whole idea of you were talking about wellness and healing, but on the other side of that, you have trauma and you have mental illness. And with this incident of the Slenderman, these two girls that committed this crime, or they were convicted, and there was a trial that came out of this. I mean, what came out of all of this is that these girls were mentally ill,
That's correct. Yeah.
and then you're talking about things like you drop the MK Ultra thing and the Kathy O'Brien on me. MK Ultra is all about trauma based
Yeah.
experiences. So what is this? I mean, we can't go into this now, of course, because we don't have the time for it. But there seems to be this layer of not only the emotional experience that you're having with the contact that you have with all of this, your immersion into it and your emotional response to it. But if there are other elements of trauma, if there are other elements of mental health issues at play here, what is that contributing to this whole discussion as well? I don't know if you have maybe a few thoughts about it.
Yes, I kind of do. So I'm just bringing up a few things so I make sure I get here. So as I pointed out, a thing where New Age spirituality and practices come into the fore is this idea of trauma. And one of the themes of the New Age is healing and growth.
Right.
And so, for example, if you look at about the confluence between esotericism and science, A.L. Aspin's book, the problem of disenchantment, points out that back in a century ago there was a crisis in epistemology and the sciences, and this leads to this creation of ideas where maybe more esoteric ideas get taken seriously by the academy, and one of these is the neo-Lamarckian idea, where certain traits can be passed on hereditary or as a hereditary basis, and one of the and this includes via our DNA. And one of the things regarding trauma is this is going back to this neo-Lamarckian idea that trauma, for example, can be passed on genetically. And there is a lot of truth in this, both on a cultural and social ideas that people who have undergone traumatic experiences early on in life through war, chronic poverty, and abuse, and this then gets passed on socially and culturally. For the famous, the sins of the father shall be passed down to the son, so on and so forth. But they actually argue that this is passed genetically. This has not been 100% proven. They say it has, but there seems to be a correlation. Haven't proven it, but it's this idea that trauma gets passed genetically. And so the idea here now is that there's a drive to be healed of this trauma. And there is this searching, this seeking for ways to heal ourselves that are not, that traditional medical science is only now catching up with. And this then leads into New Age, New Age spirituality, New Age practices. And at the heart of this is the idea that, the mind is the center and source of healing. Psychological problems are manifested in physical ailments and diseases. And at the same time, good physical health promotes good spiritual growth and development. And this Heimslios Messe I've talked about, the majority of the presentations and lectures were mostly about healing through various methods, from crystals, vibrations, biofeedback, essential oils. And this is the idea is that there's a seeking element to this. And, this idea of trauma, I don't know if you've probably noticed, there have been a series of recent documentaries. The most recent one is that was on HBO love has won.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
this is a very interesting aspect because it's quite interesting because very quickly, Love Has Won is a three-part documentary series which talks about the cult of Mother God. And if I try and remember it correctly, I'm trying to remember all the names. So this was a New Age movement, a small one, which was created by a woman called Amy Carlson. And this, Carlson grows up in Texas. She was a fairly, you know, she was a fairly standard person. But then in the 2000s, she starts going on to New Age online communities and websites. And she starts talking more about manifestations, energies, healing, angels, ascension. She then leaves her family and then moves to move in with a man who's called himself White Eagle. She moves to Colorado, but then she leaves him and she starts setting up her own cult or her own movement, shall we say, called Love Has Won. And the thing with Love Has Won is that it is it's just a smorgasbord of New Age rhetoric and worldviews. It's very incoherent. It has elements of New Age Christianity, has elements of healing and spirituality, and many of the people that come to her are in themselves damaged. They have tales of abuse and neglect, and the documentary brings this on, and it's also quite a dark documentary. It's quite unsentimental because it shows how unlike many other movements, I don't like to use the word cult, although you can call it a cult, is that um, whereas you get this obvious tale of the cult leaders through charisma and power and control, exploiting and dominating their members, what happened was the members in Love and One become true believers, and as Amy Carlson, as the Carlson's physical health problems through alcoholism and drug abuse get worse, she starts being fed colloidal silver, which they sell. By the way, they make money by peddling new age objects and commodities. It also takes in elements of spirituality. They're heavily into QAnon. Trump is a light worker. And also there's this part of this thing, what they call the galactics, where these ascended masters, which include George Michael and most famously Robin Williams. And through channeling, they speak to Amy, and it's part of this divine plan. So it's all part of the plan. And so what happens is she starts, as well as drinking huge amounts of alcohol. She's an alcoholic, effectively, drinks huge amounts of colloidal silver, and she gets worse and worse. But she's like, their distrust of medical science and hospitals, what they call 3D hospitals, because they're on the fifth dimension, by the way, in their ascension. Even when she asks to go to a hospital, they refuse. They say, Amy, come on now, stop bullshitting. This is part of the plan. And they feed her more colloidal silver, and she dies. And it's really quite an interesting documentary because as part of being damaged, and there is there's part of this big discursive current in modern society about trauma and about damage. And one big aspect is this seeking through New Age spirituality, wellness, programs of wellness. I actually did a paper on it a couple of years ago about this in Iceland, and they talk about it like in Love Has Won. By the way, what happened is, and this is spoiler alert, they end up being on Dr. Phil. Carlson unfortunately dies, kind of more through neglect. She's emaciated. She had organ failure. But what's really sad is that none of the members come to this realization. The reality principle does not affect them. They carry on. They learn nothing in this sense. after Love Is Won dissipates, they're all still doing live streaming. They're all still part of New Age and wellness communities and conspirituality communities. Their one-on-one interviews are very intense, because realize that they still truly believe the things they believe in.
Yeah.
Amy or Mother God, her dying and not ascending doesn't change their worldview. But the point is that with this seeking of healing, with this seeking of self-transformation, is that I argued that what was happening in Iceland, that far from it being a social revolution, it's just a continuation of neoliberal subjectivity, where it's the emphasis on the individual, the emphasis on self-discipline, self-regulation. You are responsible for your material, spiritual, and psychological upkeep. And what happens is like through mindfulness, meditation, through New Age practices, there's this massive ethical and social blind spot to material inequality. Because the idea is that if you're still depressed and damaged, it's a moral failing on your part. You're not trying hard enough, to ascend. You're not trying hard enough to be the best you can be. And this is where we're living in a very interesting time where the ideas of the New Age or conspiracy, various forms of occultism have blended into our social reality to where even people, quite sober people like my master's thesis advisor are going, what is happening here? What is going on with this? And of course, it leads to very reductionist ideas like, oh, these people are just crazy. They're mentally unstable. Well, yes and no. There's a spectrum of it where you can end up, becoming seemingly insane or very abnormal in comparison to social norms. Your uncle at Thanksgiving starts ranting on about Pizzagate and QAnon and the deep state. But many people involved are not insane. They are not crazy. They're people like you and I. They're living in a world where even though it's, people who are on this, our idea of consensuality is becoming way more fluid. And they are seeking an ameliorative ideas that will help them make sense of what's happening around them. And much of, especially in the last few years, moving on from my master's thesis and into my PhD thesis, my research interests have exploded from, literary ideas, theory, and speculative fiction into things like the counterculture, the New Age, contemporary esotericism. That's where my jam is right now. But thanks to my advisor Benedict, you have to look into modern esoteric currents from the 19th century. Where does this all come from?
Yeah.
I had one guy tell me like, oh yeah, Reiki got introduced to the West in 1972. And I'm like, mate, go back 90 years. And he was like, what? In Iceland, people took things like yoga. Yoga was something that arrived in Iceland in the 70s and 80s. But, you had Icelandic writers talking about yoga in the 1920s. And you have to kind of, to see where we are now, there is this historiographical aspect that esotericism studies is great at. But now we're in the mode of like, right, we now need to look at our current condition, our current situation, which is what is going on here.
Right.
And of course, that's why I feel like I have not gone insane. I've known a few people who have, become, enthralled, shall we say, by many weaponized narratives. We all have, and it can be very alarming. But once you kind of see it, like you said, once like Ala Burrows, you see the reality studio for what it is. Um, Instead of it being a negative or a pessimistic, of a loss of meaning, you can actually create your own meaning and your own ethics to be in the world, and I take the positive view of that.
Yeah.
And yeah, so hopefully, if I ever get funding, unfortunately, how we like most of the Western academia, there's issues of funding. If I know that if and when my thesis will ever get published, it will. It will already become obsolete. It will become its own fiction in itself. But yeah, so that's kind of where we are at the moment. And we're a nexus of intersecting currents, discourses, and a whole group of us, including yourself, Stephanie, are poised to at least try and make sense of it.
Right. That's what I'm trying to do.
Oh yeah, and in the face of the Lewis, we've only just started seeing this. You ain't seen nothing yet.
Right. So the stuff that we've been talking about in the past half an hour or so, is this all kind of interwoven into your PhD thesis?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh yeah. Like I said, well, I mean, maybe not quite so much the new age, although it is there. I mean, for example, in terms of fiction and reality, or theory fiction or speculative fiction, like I've mentioned way back an hour or so ago about the book Applied Palladianism.
Yeah.
Which is an incredible book, and it's written by Simon Sellers, and it's a partly fictionalized, or he calls an auto-fictional account of his life from Australia in the late 80s through to the 2010s. And the idea is that it takes this idea of a narrator who's like an avatar of Sellers, who is this disaffected teen cyberpunk in Melbourne, who one day comes across an interview with Ballard, who he realizes that Ballard is more cyberpunk than the cyberpunks. He reads Crash, and all of a sudden his whole world explodes. And he comes to this idea that the writing of Ballard contains these hermetic keys that can open hidden realities embedded within our own everyday noumenal reality itself. And his whole story is this growing obsession, this Bildungsroman, as he tries to seek the ultimate meaning of Ballard in our world. So he starts off by going into academia, by trying to do a PhD, but his own misanthropy and his own inability to, and I felt this felt like a call out to me, like his own inability to apply academic rigor. He then ends up leaving because during this time he encounters what he calls this a UFO encounter, and this is like an epistemological and occult break in him, and he becomes obsessed with UFOs, esotericism, and the occult, and he goes on this Bildungsroman. He becomes a travel writer. He sees the South Pacific, he sees Holland and many other, and Japan. He becomes this attractive occultural forms, ghosts, demons, spirits. He gets obsessed with doppelgangers. He weaves in Burroughs, Lovecraft, Kenneth Grant. All these things come into play, and he effectively, his whole world becomes untethered. Because what he's doing is, like I mentioned, he becomes like a kind of a chaos magician. Even though he doesn't mention it, he becomes a chaos where he is effectively trying to create a magical reality and overlaying it onto the material reality of everyday existence. And unfortunately, he becomes, like a lot of Lovecraftian and Ballardian protagonists, he in effect becomes insane. And what this is, though, he talks about this change in our world from neoliberalism to this cybernetic, cybercultural world, where time becomes, he talks about the Mandela effect. He talks a lot about he talks a lot about the idea of non-places of Dubai and these new builds in Holland. He meets these people who are kind of like theosophists. Their encounters with ascended masters or UFO beings, and they come away with this knowledge of concepts which were alien to them before. And I'm like, this is an esoteric text, and it also through the text it provides concrete thematic aspects of my thesis, this conflation between accelerationism as a heuristic and as a concept and contemporary esotericism. And therefore, I look into, through chaos magic and the CCRU, its roots in the counterculture. It's very important that, because early chaos magic, for example, we talk about it like this punk year zero explosion in 1978. But more recent academic study by people like Vasilios Metadiadis, I may have to go back on that. He's just recently done an essay that's been published in Eerie, which blows open the academic study of chaos magic, because he basically finds the first edition of Liber Null by Pete Carroll. Pays hundreds of pounds for it, and it's quite rare, but he gets a copy and he realizes something. Number one, there is no mention of chaos magic in the first edition. The chaos is not the concept of the cosmos, it's the Tao. You realize that actually what they do is that both Sherwin and Carroll are riffing of countercultural ideas, such as kind of libertarianism, anarchism, what Christian Greer calls the chaos discourse. They are, for example, in early articles they write for the New Equinox, they cite people like Carlos Castaneda, they cite Zen Buddhism. In the Book of Results, Ray Sherwin likens the theory behind civilization, the idea of this implanting of our desire at a subconscious level, to Dianetics. Yep. Yes, it's in there, and it's like, and so they're going with this counterculture, and then what happens is that by the time you get to the third edition, 87, which we all have electronically or physically, that's where it moves from the Tao to chaos. The integration of Discordianism, the use of the occult persona of the shaman, the embedding of chaos science, not just in the book, but we start getting it in chaos magic discourse through the zines. But what happens is you also got to understand that that the counterculture had a political dimension, but it wasn't political, it was a cultural revolution. And so even though there was overlaps with what you might call the new left of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was a big antipathy towards many aspects of the new left, such as feminism. For example, there's an essay in the New Equinox called The Politics of Dilemma, which rails against feminism for trying to impose control on what women can say and do. It is against liberty and freedom. And they take this aspect, Carroll and Sherwin and others, that we are about liberty against the forces of mediocrity and the forces of the mainstream, right? But what happens is, running parallel to the 70s, especially to the 80s, when Thatcher and Reagan come into power, is that neoliberalism is being imposed. And it's not just a political and economic, it's a hegemonic project. It's cultural. They co-opt the aesthetics of the counterculture, rebellion, alienation, subversion, to argue that neoliberalism is against order, bureaucratic orders and structures. It links the individualism and the anarchism of individuality in the counterculture with economic freedom. You see, the power, it's like the freedom to choose, and so on and so forth. And so what you get is, as well as through through New Age spirituality, you start in certain aspects of chaos magic, the chaos magic scene in the UK. You start seeing them to reflect and then reify this, because neoliberalism argues itself as going against the mainstream, going against what Nick Land called the cathedral of egalitarianism, multiculturalism, liberal democracy, and political correctness, and so that's why quite a few of the early members of or the early pioneers of chaos magic, now sound like your uncle at Thanksgiving, or what we call it, about wokeism and stuff like this. And because neoliberalism captures the Promethean and the revolutionary aspects. They co-opt it. They recuperate the aesthetics and weave it into its own mythos, and saying, we are the way of the future. We are revolutionary, both in terms of business, but in terms of society. And so what happens is people internalize that, and chaos magicians were no exception.
Bob, if this is all in your PhD thesis, I cannot wait to read this. You've got to finish this, man.
Well, I have to, but I feel sorry for my advisor and my external committee, because they've got to read it first. So, yeah.
Well, you have just blown me away today with everything that you have shared. It's like everything that you talked about, it was like a nugget of something else that we could talk about for hours and hours and hours. I am just blown away. I've thoroughly enjoyed myself talking to you, or actually listening more than I actually was talking, but that was wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing all of this. This is helping me as well to try to give this a more coherent place in my own mind and my own understanding of what this is all about. You've added so many new elements and dimensions to this discussion that I'm a lot of food for thought here.
Now you basically see what poor Benedict has to deal with every time we visit. I'm kind of like, with the lines going, it's all connected, and he's just like, oh my God, what's he doing? But it was a pleasure. It was a privilege, to go on this. And as you can hear, I could talk for 2 more hours and become that weird, intense guy who corners you in a bar,
Well, we can always schedule another talk. We can always talk about more things, because I'm sure once I go back to listen to this again during my editing process, that I'm going to have all of these questions like, well, what about this? And what about that? I'll write them all down and I'll send them to you, and then we can talk about it later.
What I will finally say is that, this, one of the fun things about this academic field, which you've been part of and that I am now part of, is that you get people who understand this. I mean, I have been working a lot over the past couple of years with Phil Lagarde from Leeds Metropolitan University about zine culture in the UK, which then has been linked in with the work of Christian Greer, who is also talking about contemporary esotericism and occulture. And you're seeing now is like, there are people who are actively looking into this. We've done the historiographical project. Now we're looking more into the present and making sense of the present. And, I don't want to make the whole like standing on the shoulder of giants, but, the work that's been happening allows people like myself and others. And I will mention again, people like Vasilios. He has just finished a PhD project about the kind of the material history of chaos magic from the 1978 to 2000, which hopefully will be coming out in the next year, which will be, Colin Duggan said there will probably never be a definitive history of chaos magic. Well, it's happened. And the fact is there are people looking into it. Phil's own work on ethnography and also occultural scenes in the UK in the late 90s and the 2000s. I've read his PhD. It's incredible stuff. And And there's many other people right now who are doing incredible work about New Age spirituality, conspiracy theory, um, esoteric practice, and also the blending of our field with esoteric practice. That was the theme at this year's ESWE
Right.
conference.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, there may be arguments and schisms and kerfuffles, but through the work, through the patience and diligence of my advisor and also my external committee. Shout out to Christine Ferguson and Per Faxnell who kick my arse on a regular basis, metaphorically. But in applying the rigor, like you said, this is, you know, why do we do this? It's a fascination. We're fascinated
Yeah,
by this. We're
definitely.
in our own right.
Definitely. Well, I thank you for bringing me in touch with Phil. I plan to be talking with him in the next couple of months about what he's doing. So I'm really looking forward to that too. But back to you. How can people find you online and follow what you're doing should they be interested?
Oh my goodness. Well, unfortunately, I quit Twitter last month. Uh,
Okay.
it's ethical. I mean,
Yeah.
I cannot abide, giving my time on a platform that's run by, again, a person who, Elon Musk, who openly said just last week that legal lawsuits about stealing content and art for the use of AI algorithms will be null and void because the AI god will come and render all this superfluous anyway. And everyone was going, what the hell is that all about? But if you
Mm.
know, so I am currently on Facebook.
Okay.
I am currently have an academia page where some of my writing is on. I also am on B Sky. I will give links to all this, but
Okay.
essentially, um, I am right now in what we may call the hermetic master in the cave phase, where my time is spent writing and delving over magazines written in 1987 and listening to drum and bass music. And I am I am basically that lovely but weird guy in the corner of the PhD department, you know, with witchcraft and Japanese horror manga and ballad and stuff. But apparently, I'm definitely the most interesting person in the department.
I'm sure
But
you are. I'm sure you are.
so just real life stuff. But yes, I am accessible on social media, and people can come and speak to me, and I will try not to scare them away.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so I will be sure to add those links and other pertinent information in the program notes. I'll also include a link to your master's thesis for those who are curious to read it for
We, oh,
themselves.
oh no!
It was a good read. Don't put yourself down. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank
So Bob, thanks again. I really, really appreciate your time. Really appreciate this really wonderful, fascinating conversation. And I wish you all the best. Good luck with finishing the PhD thesis.
you.
And as well, I wish you also very happy holidays ahead because we're in that month. So
Oh my
thanks
goodness.
again.
Oh, no, oh, no, no, no. I just realized I have to go shopping this week. Um, but yeah, but hey, it's a wonderful time. Yes. And we didn't have time to go into the folklore of Icelandic Christmas. We have 13 Santas. You know,
Wow.
the Jólasvein, the Yule lads. There are 13 of them, and they are kind of like sons of this horrible troll called Grilla. And effectively, she has a beast called the Christmas cat, the Jólakötturinn. And if you're a evil or bad child, then the Jólakötturinn will snatch you in the night and take you to Grilla, and she will eat you. But her sons, that were mistreated, the Yule lads, escaped their evil mother, and now they put gifts for all the nice boys and girls. You leave your shoe on your windowsill for on 13 nights in the run to the international Santa coming. You leave little gifts.
I
Yeah,
love it. I love it.
it's sweet. Yes.
Sounds like a little amalgamation of everything that I've ever heard about different traditions around.
Yeah.
Around.
And near total darkness does help. So
Right, right. Well, Good luck with all of that. I wish you all of the most wonderful celebrations with your 13 Santa Clauses and your demons and whatever else you have going on there. Okay, thank you so much, Bob. Take care.
Thank you so much. You have a lovely day there, Stephanie.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. My thanks again to Bob for this awesome discussion about so many things. To circle back to the article, Bob mentioned that, in his view, blows open the study of chaos magic. It's called Book Zero Through the Years, the first 2 editions of Peter Carroll's Liber Null. It's found in Eerie's journal, and it's by Vasileios M. Neletiadis. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I was able to find the article as open access, and I've provided the link in the program notes. For myself, I think that one of the really important things that came out of this interview was that neoliberalism was running parallel to all of the developments in the CCRU and chaos magic spheres in the 1980s. The aesthetics of the counterculture that were so important in the beginning were flipped by some in the occult community to argue that neoliberalism is against bureaucratic orders and structures, and that individualism and anarchy are linked with economic freedom. In certain groups, particularly in the UK, according to Bob, as well as in some New Age groups, neoliberalism is argued as going against the mainstream. Some of the early pioneers of chaos magic have undergone this shift. Because neoliberalism does capture, quote, Promethean and, quote, revolutionary aspects, these people co-opted or recuperated the original aesthetics and wove it into its own mythos. This really stood out to me and was super helpful for my own understanding of certain current differing viewpoints of some people within the larger occult community. So I thank Bob for that. Okay, that's all for now. Please check out the program notes for more information and links. I wish you all a very happy holiday season. Thanks so much for your patience, and as always, thanks for listening.